In the dead of winter 1610, a Hungarian nobleman named György Thurzó led his men through the frozen gates of Čachtice Castle. They were prepared for the cold, but not for the smell that greeted them inside. A foul mixture of wood smoke and something metallic, something terribly wrong. Deep in the castle's dungeons, the darkest rumors that haunted the nearby villages became a gruesome reality. They found a young girl chained in a cell, alive, but with eyes so empty her mind had already fled this terrible place. Then they found another. Finally, they entered a room and discovered the source of the smell. The body of a young woman on a table, her skin as white as snow and covered in hundreds of puncture marks, as if every drop of life had been pulled from her. But the architect of this horror wasn't a ghoul hiding in the shadows. She was found in her dining hall, a figure of immense, cold, aristocratic pride. This was Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the niece of a king and a member of the legendary, wolf-blooded Bathory clan, a family whose dark legacy in Transylvania is rivaled only by that of Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration for Dracula. When confronted with the horrors discovered below, she showed no remorse, only pure, cold anger at the sheer disrespect of men invading her home. This presents a terrifying puzzle. How does a woman of such genius and refinement become the monster accused of these atrocities? Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, strange histories, and forgotten legends are worth remembering, if you believe the mysteries of our past should not be lost, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we will open her castle gates. We will trace the origins of the Blood Countess across history, from the legends of Transylvania to a lonely castle in Hungary, from the trial that shocked a kingdom to the vampire stories that stalk our movies and books today. This is not only the story of a monster, it is the story of absolute power, our own vanity, our own shadow, the dragon within the queen. To understand that dragon, we must first see the gilded cage that created her. Before she was the Blood Countess, she was a child prodigy, a lonely queen trapped in a prison of her own power. And to solve the riddle of what she became, we must first travel back in time to meet the brilliant, terrifying girl she was. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the woman who would become the monster, you must first understand the name she was given at birth. That name was Bathory, and in 16th century Hungary, that name was not just a name. It was a promise and a threat. It meant power. The Bathory family was one of the oldest and most important families in the entire kingdom. They were not simply rich. Rich merchants had gold, but the Bathorys had land. Vast areas of land that stretched for miles, covered in dark forests, wide rivers, and hundreds of villages filled with people who lived and died under their rule. They built huge stone castles that were symbols of their strength, and they led armies into battle. For centuries, the name Bathory meant victory, and it meant fear. They were the princes of a wild and beautiful land called Transylvania. It was a place of old mountains and deep shadows, a place of legend. And the people who lived there whispered that the Bathory family was different from other nobles. They said the family was wolf-blooded. It meant they were proud. It meant they were fierce. And it meant that sometimes There was a wildness inside them, a dangerous spark that could not be tamed. The family was known for its two sides. On one side, they were brilliant. They were clever, brave, and born to be leaders. But on the other side, there was a darkness, a history of terrible tempers, of strange moods, and of a cruelty that seemed to run through their veins like a poison. This was the family that produced heroes, and this was the family that produced tyrants. Elizabeth's own uncle was the greatest example of the family's power. His name was Stephen Bathory, and he was not just a prince or a lord. He was the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania. He was one of the most respected and powerful rulers in all of Europe. This was the family Elizabeth was born into. She was not just another girl from a noble house. She was a Bathory, the niece of a king. From the moment she was born, the world expected her to be great. It expected her to be powerful. It expected her to be brilliant, and it would not be disappointed. But the world did not know about the family's other side. It did not know about the darkness that came with the blood of the wolf. And in Elizabeth, that darkness would find its perfect home. Elizabeth grew up in a world made of silk and stone. From her earliest days, it was clear that she was not like other children. She was a prodigy, a true genius. At a time when many powerful noblemen could barely write their own names, young Elizabeth was learning to master languages. She became fluent in 4 of them: Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. Her mind was a sharp, brilliant diamond. She was raised in pure luxury. She had dresses made of the finest fabrics, jewels that sparkled in the candlelight, and servants who were there to bring her anything she could ever want. She lived inside a beautiful, golden painting. But a painting, no matter how beautiful, can also be a prison. Her childhood was not a time of warmth or simple games. It was a time of training. She was not just a girl. She was a political piece, a valuable object that belonged to the great Bathory family. Her lessons were not just about reading and writing. They were about power. She learned how to command servants, how to speak to powerful men, and how to hide her true feelings behind a face of cold, noble pride. She was surrounded by people every single day, but she was deeply, terribly alone. And there was something else, something that separated her even further from the world. From a young age, Elizabeth suffered from a mysterious illness. Without warning, her body would be taken over by violent seizures. She would fall to the ground, her body shaking, her mind lost in a storm. In the superstitious world of the 16th century, people had a dark explanation for this. They whispered that the girl was not just sick. They whispered that a demon had taken hold of her, a darkness living inside her perfect, noble body. But perhaps it was not the work of a demon. Perhaps it was something even more tragic. Perhaps her mind was simply too bright, too powerful for the body of a young girl. A mind that felt everything, the good and the bad, so intensely that sometimes it would simply break under the pressure. These fits were the first cracks in the beautiful, gilded cage she lived in. A sign that inside the perfect princess, there was a deep and troubled world that no one could see. A world that would one day burst out and drown her world in darkness. In the world of the powerful, a daughter's hand in marriage is one of the most valuable things a family has. It is not given for love. It is a piece in a great political game. It is a way to join 2 powerful families together, to create an alliance so strong that no one can stand against it. For a girl as important as Elizabeth Báthory, her marriage was a deal made almost as soon as she could walk. When she was just 10 years old, a child playing in the cold halls of her family's castle, she was promised. The man she was promised to was named Ferenc Nadasdy. He was the son of another one of Hungary's most powerful families. By joining the Bathorys and the Nadastys, this marriage would create a force that could shape the future of the entire kingdom. At age 15, the deal was sealed. Elizabeth became his wife, but Ferenc Nadasdy was not a simple husband. He was a living legend. He was known across the land as the Black Knight of Hungary. He was not a prince who sat in a comfortable chair. He was a soldier, and the battlefield was his true home. His entire life was dedicated to one single brutal purpose: fighting the armies of the powerful Ottoman Empire, who were constantly trying to invade the kingdom from the south. He was Hungary's shield, and he was terrifyingly good at his job. He was a brilliant commander, but he was also known for his extreme brutality. In war, he was merciless. He showed his enemies no pity, and his victories were always soaked in blood. But in the violent world of the 16th century, this was not seen as a weakness. His cruelty on the battlefield was seen as a sign of his strength. He was respected. He was celebrated. He was a national hero. This was the man Elizabeth married, a man whose life was violence, a man whose greatness was measured by how many of his enemies he had killed. He was a celebrated hero, and he was almost never home. Right after their grand wedding, a celebration of power more than love, the Black Knight returned to the place he belonged, the battlefield. He left his young, brilliant wife behind to wait for him in his vast, empty castle. He had given her his name, his wealth, and his power. But he had also given her his absence. And so, the Black Knight went to war. He was gone, not for weeks or months, but for years at a time. While he was away fighting the great armies of the South, his teenage wife was left in charge of everything. And Elizabeth did not just wait, she ruled. She was the absolute master of the Nadasdy family's vast lands. She was the boss of thousands of people. She was in charge of the farms that fed them, the villages they lived in, and the strong stone castles that protected them. She collected the money, she paid the soldiers, and she made sure there was enough food for everyone. The people who worked for her learned quickly that their new lady was not a weak little girl. She was intelligent, she was efficient, and she was very, very strict. She demanded perfect obedience, and she was not afraid to punish those who failed her. During the day, the castle was her kingdom. It was a busy world of noise and activity. Servants, soldiers, and officials would line up, waiting for her decisions. She was a queen on her throne, and her power was real. But at night, the noise would fade, the servants would go to their beds, the fires would burn low, and the castle would become quiet. In the long dark hours, her kingdom became her prison. She would walk the vast empty halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had power over thousands, but she had no one to talk to. She had wealth beyond imagination, but she had no friends. She was the lonely queen of a silent castle. The only connection she had to her husband, the only proof that he was still alive, would arrive by horse. A tired messenger would bring a letter from the distant battlefield. But these were not love letters. They were not filled with soft words or loving thoughts. They were reports from the war. The paper they were written on smelled of smoke and steel. Sometimes they were even stained with mud and blood. They told stories of battles won, of enemies killed, and of the brutal business of war. This was what she learned in those long, lonely years. She learned that power was a tool to keep order. She learned that fear was the best way to make people obey. And she learned that in her cold, empty world, the only thing she could truly rely on was her own strength and her own will. She was learning to be a ruler, and she was learning to be alone. The lands that Elizabeth controlled were huge. The villages were far apart, separated by thick forests and winding roads. News traveled slowly, and in this isolated world, Elizabeth knew that her power was the only thing holding it all together. Her husband was a ghost, a name whispered by the soldiers. She was the one who was real. She was the one they saw every day, and she believed that their respect for her was the only wall that stood between order and chaos. One day, a servant girl was caught stealing. It was a small thing, a piece of bread perhaps, or a silver button from a dress. The girl was young and probably hungry or foolish. In another home, she might have been scolded or had her pay taken away. But this was not another home. This was the kingdom of Elizabeth Báthory. And Elizabeth did not see a hungry girl. She saw a crack in the wall. From her perspective, the theft was not about the stolen object. It was a challenge, a test of her authority. If one servant could break the rules and not be punished, then another would try, and then another. Soon, the whispers would start in the villages. They would say that the Countess was soft, that her husband was gone, and the woman who ruled in his place was weak. And weakness was a disease. It was a sickness that could spread through her lands like a plague, and she knew she had to cut it out before it could grow. So, she decided to make an example of the girl. She had her brought to the center of the castle courtyard, for all the other servants to see. She ordered her guards to punish the girl, not in a quick or quiet way, but in a slow, public, and brutal way. The other servants were forced to watch. They saw the girl's tears. They heard her cries. And they understood the message Elizabeth was sending. It was a message written in pain. It said, "I am the one who makes the rules here. There is no one above me, and this is what happens when you forget." This act of cold, calculated cruelty was a turning point. It was not yet the work of a monster who killed for pleasure. It was the work of a lonely queen who believed that fear and respect were the same thing. She was speaking the only language she had ever truly learned from her family and from her famous husband. It was the language of absolute power and necessary pain. It was a lesson she was learning to speak very, very well, and it was a lesson she would soon begin to enjoy. Then, in the year 1604, news arrived at the castle. But this was not another letter smelling of smoke and steel. It was the final message from the battlefield. Ferenc Nadasdy, the great Black Knight of Hungary, the hero who had survived countless battles, was dead. He was not killed by an enemy's sword, but by a sudden illness that took him in his war camp. And with his death, everything changed. The one man whose power was equal to her own was gone. The one person in the world who could, perhaps, have controlled her was gone. Elizabeth Báthory was now a widow, but she was not a sad, weak figure in black. She inherited her husband's great wealth and his many castles, adding them to the vast power of her own family. She became, in an instant, wealthier and more powerful than she had ever been before. She was no longer the lonely queen of the castle, waiting for news from a distant husband. She was the absolute, unquestioned master of her own world. For all those years, her husband's life had been like a chain, however long, that kept her connected to the world of men, war, and politics. Now, that chain was broken, and a dragon, finally freed from its chain, is a hungry creature. The question was, what would it feast on? In the first months after her husband's death, Elizabeth did what was expected of her. She wore black. She lived in quiet mourning, and she grieved. The loss was real. Ferenc Nadasdy had been more of a shadow than a husband, but he was the great, defining shadow of her life. He was her partner in power, and his death left a hole in her world. But for a mind like Elizabeth's, grief does not last forever. The sharp pain slowly fades, and in its place, something else begins to grow. Something quiet and slow, and far more dangerous: boredom. For years, her brilliant mind had been occupied. Running the huge estates was a difficult job that required all of her focus, all of her energy. It was a challenge. Now, after so many years, it was no longer a challenge. The work was easy. The problems were small. Her mind, a powerful engine built for war and strategy, had nothing to do. It was like a fast, strong horse, locked in a tiny stable with nowhere to run. The people around her did not help. She was the Countess. She was surrounded by servants, officials, and advisors. But they were not her equals. They were her employees. They were paid to say yes. They bowed when she entered a room. They told her she was wise. They told her she was beautiful. They never disagreed with her. They never challenged her. They never told her no. She was completely, totally alone at the top of her own small mountain. And so, the immense energy of her mind, with no great problems to solve, began to turn inward. It focused on smaller, more personal things. She would spend hours staring into a silver mirror, watching her own face. She would look for any new line, any sign that time was touching her. In the vast, silent halls of her castle, she became obsessed with the one enemy she could not command, the one force she could not defeat: her own aging. Her powerful mind, with no outlet, began to search for a new project, a new obsession, a new, darker kind of science. And in the shadows of her court, there were people waiting, people who knew her weaknesses, people who would not tell her no, but would instead whisper yes. People who would help her build a new kind of kingdom, not of land or of wealth, but of secret rituals and of pain. A predator of this kind is never truly alone. A queen, even a dark one, needs a court. And as Elizabeth's obsession grew, she began to gather a strange and loyal group of helpers around her. They were not her friends. They were extensions of her will. They were her hands, her eyes, and the instruments of her cruelty. The first, and perhaps the most important, was a woman named Dorco. She was an old woman, her face a map of wrinkles, and her mind was filled with the superstitions and folk magic of the old country. She was the one who whispered ideas into Elizabeth's ear. When the Countess worried about a new line on her face, Dorco would not offer science or reason. She would offer magic. She spoke of ancient, secret remedies, of folk power that had been passed down from woman to woman for centuries. She presented the idea of using blood not as a horrifying crime, but as a lost art, a secret power that only the strongest women were brave enough to use. Then there was Ilona Jo. Ilona had known Elizabeth since she was a baby. She had been her wet nurse, the woman who fed her and held her and cared for her when her own mother was busy with politics. In Ilona's heart, the powerful Countess was still that little child, and her love for that child was a blind, absolute loyalty. She would do anything to please her mistress, anything to soothe her worries. If the Countess needed a special herb, Ilona would find it. If the Countess needed a secret kept, Ilona would take it to her grave. Her love was so complete that it was twisted into a powerful poison. She became an enabler, the loving mother figure who would help her child do the most terrible things. Every court needs a soldier, and Elizabeth's had János Újvári, a man they called Fickó. He was not smart. He was not a thinker. He was a man of great physical strength and simple, dog-like loyalty. When the Countess gave an order, he did not ask why. He did not think about whether it was right or wrong. He simply obeyed. He was the muscle of the group, the brute force that was needed when a task required a strong arm and a quiet mouth. And finally, there was Erzsébet Majerova. She was the housekeeper at another one of Elizabeth's castles, and she was the most practical member of this dark circle. She was the organizer. While Dorco dreamed of magic and Ilona offered comfort, Elizabeth managed the details. She was the one who knew which local families were the poorest. She knew which parents were the most desperate to give their daughters a better life. And she knew which girls, if they were to disappear from the world, would not be missed. This was the Coven. The old mystic, the loving nurse, the loyal brute, and the clever housekeeper. They gathered around their lonely queen, bound together by her power and by the dark secrets they were beginning to share. The stage was now set, the actors were in place, and the first act of the horror was about to begin. Elizabeth Bathory had defeated every enemy she had ever faced. She controlled her lands, her people, and her future. But there was one enemy she could not command, an enemy that lived inside her own castle, that watched her every day, and that told her a truth she did not want to hear. That enemy was her mirror. In her private chambers, late at night when the castle was silent, Elizabeth would sit before a large mirror made of polished silver. For years, the mirror had shown her the face of a queen, a face of pale, perfect skin, of dark, intelligent eyes, and of a mouth set in a line of confident power. It was the face of a Bathory. It was the face of youth. But now, she was in her mid-40s, and the mirror was beginning to betray her. It showed her a tiny, fine line near the corner of her eye, a line that had not been there last year. It showed her the faint shadow under her chin, where her skin was no longer as tight as a drum. These were small things, things that another woman might accept as the simple, natural work of time. But to Elizabeth, they were not natural. They were an attack. In her world, a noblewoman's beauty was a kind of power. It was a sign of her health, her strength, and her family's superior blood. And for Elizabeth, control was everything. She could control her servants. She could control her money. She could control her castles. But she could not control time. Aging was a thief, breaking into her own body and stealing her youth. It was a rebellion happening inside her own skin, and it terrified her. It was the first battle she had ever fought that she knew she was going to lose. This was not just about looking pretty. This was a terrifying loss of control. The face in the mirror was no longer just her own. It was a daily reminder that she was mortal, that she was weak, that her power was not as absolute as she believed. The reflection became her tyrant, its silent judgment a constant nagging whisper in her ear. And as she stared into her own eyes, she saw that the small lines on her face were like the small cracks that had been forming in her soul. The loneliness, the boredom, the cold cruelty she was beginning to practice. It was all there. The decay on the inside was finally starting to show on the outside, and Elizabeth Báthory decided she would go to war with time itself. She would do anything, absolutely anything, to win. The war with time was a quiet one, fought inside Elizabeth's own mind, in the silence of her chambers. But a war needs a weapon. And one afternoon, by complete accident, she found one. The scene was a normal one. Elizabeth was sitting before her mirror, and a young servant girl was combing her long, dark hair. Perhaps the girl was tired. Perhaps she was nervous, her hands trembling as she worked on the hair of the powerful Countess. She made a small mistake. The comb caught in a knot, and she pulled, just a little too hard. A sharp sting of pain shot through Elizabeth's scalp. In an instant, all the boredom, all the frustration, all the silent rage she felt at her own aging exploded. She did not scold the girl. She did not warn her. She reacted with the speed of a striking snake. She turned and struck the girl across the face. It was not a simple slap. It was a blow of pure, unrestrained fury. The force of it sent the girl stumbling backwards, a cry of pain and shock on her lips. A few drops of the servant girl's blood flew through the air and landed on the back of the Countess's hand. Elizabeth looked down at the small red beads on her pale skin. She was annoyed. She grabbed a silk cloth to wipe the blood away, but as she cleaned her skin, she paused. Her eyes narrowed. She stared at the spot where the blood had been. The skin underneath seemed different. It looked smoother. The color seemed brighter, more alive. The small, faint lines seemed to have vanished. Was it real? Or did she simply want to see it so badly that her mind made it real for her? It did not matter. In that moment, a new and terrible idea was planted. It was an idea that connected her fading youth to the blood of the young, an idea that whispered that the pain of another could be the secret to her own preservation. She looked from her own smooth hand to the crying, bleeding face of the young servant girl. And for the first time, she did not just see a clumsy servant. She saw a solution. She saw a harvest. The Countess stood frozen, staring at her own hand, her mind racing with this new, terrible possibility. She was not the only one in the room. Watching from the shadows was the old woman, Dorco. Dorco had served the Bathory family her entire life. She understood their pride, and she knew her mistress's great fear of growing old. She saw the look in Elizabeth's eyes. It was not a look of guilt for having struck the girl. It was a look of discovery, and Dorco, the woman of old ways and dark secrets, seized her opportunity. She moved to the Countess's side, her voice a low, raspy whisper that no one else could hear. "Blood, my lady," she breathed, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "It is the oldest magic, the blood of a healthy young girl. It is like the morning dew for the skin. It holds life. It can make old things new again." And with those words, the terrible thought in Elizabeth's mind became a plan. The madness now had a purpose. It was no longer just about anger or punishment. It would be a science, a ritual. This is how it began, not with a great bath of blood, but with small, secret acts of cruelty. A servant girl would make a mistake, drop a silver plate, or be too slow with an order. Her mistake would be the excuse. She would be taken to a private room, away from the others. Ilona Jo, the loyal nurse, would be there to calm her, telling her everything would be all right. And Fichko, the strong and silent servant, would be there to hold her down. The punishments were no longer just a beating. Now they would collect the blood, just a small amount, in a silver bowl. And later that night, in her chambers, the Countess would perform her new beauty ritual. She would use the blood as a lotion, rubbing it onto her face and hands, staring into her mirror, believing with all her heart that she was fighting a war against time, and that this terrible magic was helping her win. Each time, her helpers would tell her that it was working. "You look younger today, my lady," they would whisper. And she would believe them. It was a perfect system of madness, delusion, and cruelty, all happening within the locked rooms of the lonely castle. For a time, this was the system. A secret, horrifying routine for beauty. A grotesque spa treatment happening in the hidden, fire-lit chambers of the castle. The victims were always the girls who already worked for her. Girls who were trapped inside the castle walls, their cries for help swallowed by the thick stone. It was a contained horror. A secret kept by the Countess and her small, loyal coven. But the results were never enough. The mirror was a cruel master, and it always demanded more. The small amounts of blood were not working the magic she wanted. She needed more. She needed a stronger supply. The dragon's hunger was growing. Soon, the girls already inside the castle were not enough. Her obsession had become too big to be fed by just the servants in her home. It needed to look beyond the castle walls. It needed to look towards the villages, filled with healthy young women, their lives untouched by the darkness that lived on the hill. The need could no longer be contained. The hunt was about to begin. The story we have told so far has been about the mind of one powerful woman, a journey into her private world of pride and fear. But now, our story must change. We must leave the dark, secret rooms of the castle. We must travel down the winding path from the hill to the small villages that huddle in the valley below. Because the true story of horror is never just about the monster. It is about the innocent people the monster destroys. This part of our story is difficult to hear, but for the victims who had no voice, their story must be told. So, let us forget the Countess in her castle for a moment. Let us instead meet a girl named Ilona. Ilona did not live in a world of silk and silver. Her world was made of wood and mud and hard work. She lived with her family in a small hut with a dirt floor and a roof made of straw. Her life was not easy. From the moment the sun came up, her day was filled with chores. She would help her mother tend their small garden. She would fetch water from the village well, and she would watch over her younger brother as he played. Her hands were rough from work, not soft from expensive lotions. Her clothes were simple and patched, not made of velvet. Her life was small, but it was hers, and it was filled with simple hopes. Ilona did not dream of becoming a queen. She dreamed of a new pair of shoes for the winter, a pair that did not have holes. She dreamed of a harvest so good that her family would have a full pot of stew on the fire every night. Perhaps, on quiet evenings, she dreamed of meeting a kind boy from the next village, of falling in love, and of having a small family of her own one day. Her world was the warm sun on her face in the summer, the smell of baking bread from her mother's oven, and the sound of her brother's laughter. She was a good daughter, a good sister, and a good friend. She was a normal girl, living a normal life. And high above her small village, on the hill that touched the clouds, the woman in the castle was looking for a new harvest. And Ilona, in her innocence, had no idea that the monster was about to come looking for her. One day, a visitor arrived in Ilona's village. This was unusual. Strangers rarely came to such a small, poor place. The visitor was a woman, and she was not like the people of the village. She was well dressed, her clothes were clean, and she spoke with the confident voice of someone who had never known hunger. This was Elizabeth Báthory, the housekeeper from the Countess's court. She did not come looking like a monster. She came looking like a savior. She gathered the families of the village and she spoke to them with a kind smile. She told them that the great and noble Countess Bathory was looking for strong, bright, and honest young women to work as servants in her magnificent castle. She spoke of a life that was like a fairy tale to these poor people, a life with warm rooms, with good food to eat every single day, and with beautiful clothes to wear. And, she said, the Countess would pay well. A girl who worked at the castle could send money home to her family, money that could fix a leaking roof, or buy medicine for a sick parent, or put food on the table during the long, hard winter. For the poor families of the village, this was not just a job offer, it was a miracle. It was a ray of sunlight in a life of endless grey struggle. Ilona's parents listened, their hearts filled with a mix of hope and fear. They looked at their daughter, Ilona, so full of life and strength. They looked at their own hard hands, their simple hut. They wanted more for her. They wanted her to have a life better than their own. How could they say no to this incredible opportunity? How could they stand in the way of her one chance to escape a life of hardship? And so, with tears in their eyes and with heavy hearts, they agreed. Ilona was overjoyed. She promised her parents she would work hard. She would make them proud. She would send them money. She hugged her little brother goodbye and told him to be a good boy. She packed her few small things and, with a hopeful smile on her face, she walked away from her village, following the well-dressed woman from the castle. As she walked, she looked up at the great stone fortress on the hill. It looked like a palace in the sky. She believed she was walking towards her new life. She did not know she was walking towards her end. The journey to the castle was the most exciting trip of Ilona's young life. As she got closer, The stone fortress on the hill grew larger and larger until it filled the entire sky. It was bigger than her whole village put together. Its towers seemed to scratch the clouds, and great flags with the Countess's family symbol snapped and waved in the cold wind. She felt a thrill of awe and a little bit of fear. She, a simple village girl, was going to live here. The housekeeper, Elizabeth, led her to the massive front gate. With a deep, groaning sound of heavy wood and old iron, the gate was pulled open just enough for them to walk through. And as soon as they were inside, it was closed again behind them. The gate shut with a loud, heavy thud. The sound echoed off the high stone walls. It was a final sound, a sound that said, "You are inside now, you do not leave." And in that moment, Ilona felt the first cold prickle of real fear. She looked at the housekeeper, the woman who had been so kind and friendly in the village. But the kind smile was gone. The woman's face was now a hard, cold mask. Her eyes were no longer friendly. They were the eyes of a wolf looking at a lamb. A rough hand grabbed Ilona's arm. She was pulled along, deeper into the castle. But they did not take her to the busy kitchen, where the other servants would be laughing and working. They did not take her to the warm, bright rooms where the noble family lived. They led her down a different path, down a long, quiet hallway where the air was cold and still, down a winding set of stone stairs into the shadows. Ilona's heart began to beat like a drum against her ribs. This was wrong. This was all wrong. This was not the way to a better life. This was the way to a trap. The housekeeper stopped in front of a heavy, dark wooden door in a part of the castle that felt old and forgotten. This was not a servant's bedroom. This was a prison cell, and as the iron key turned in the lock, Ilona knew. She was not here to work. She was here to be the harvest. What happened to Ilona and to the dozens, perhaps hundreds of girls who followed her through the castle gates, is the darkest part of our story. The details come from the testimonies of those who survived and from the chilling confessions of the Countess's own helpers. This was not chaos. It was a system, a routine. For Elizabeth, these girls were no longer people. They were subjects in a series of terrible private experiments. In her twisted mind, she was a kind of scientist, and her laboratory was the dungeon. She was testing different ways to cause pain, trying to find the most efficient method to harvest the life force from her victims. She would watch with a chilling focus, as if observing a chemical reaction. Which method produced the most fear? Which produced the most blood? Each act of cruelty was a new test, each scream a piece of data in her monstrous research. One of her favorite experiments used the brutal Hungarian winter as its weapon. A girl would be dragged into the castle courtyard in the dead of night, stripped of her clothes, and forced to stand in the freezing snow. From a high window, wrapped in warm furs, the Countess would watch as her helpers poured buckets of icy water over the girl, again and again. The sound of the water hitting the frozen ground would echo in the night. The girl's skin would turn blue, then white. The water would freeze into a thick shell of ice, trapping her. Elizabeth would watch, patiently, until her subject became a silent, living statue, a monument to the killing power of the cold. Another experiment used fire. The old iron tongs that had lifted logs into the fire for years were now given a new, terrible purpose. They would be heated in the great fireplace until their tips glowed a bright, angry red. In a dark room, lit only by a few candles, the Countess would conduct her test, studying the effects of heat on human skin. Sometimes, for a smaller, more intimate kind of pain, she would simply use the burning candles themselves, the smell of melting wax mingling with the scent of terror. Sometimes, the experiment was about hunger. This was a test of the mind as much as the body. Girls would be locked away in the darkness, given no food for days, sometimes weeks. They were left to waste away, listening to the sounds of the living castle just outside their door, smelling the food from the kitchens, driven mad by a hunger that would never be satisfied. And in her darkest moments of rage, her scientific curiosity would disappear and the wolf blood of her family would take over. The testimonies claim that she would fall upon a victim like a wild animal, biting chunks of flesh from their arms, shoulders, and faces. But the most famous story, the legend that turned the Countess into a timeless nightmare, was the tale of the Iron Maiden. The legend says this was her masterpiece of pain, a tall metal case built in the shape of a beautiful woman. On the outside, it was a work of art. On the inside, it was a machine, lined with dozens of sharp silver spikes. A girl would be forced inside. The doors would be slowly closed. As the spikes slid into her body, her blood would pour down, collected in a small basin at the bottom. Most historians today believe this terrible machine was not real, but the story itself tells a truth. The horror in that castle was so great, so creative, so thoughtfully evil, that people needed a legend just as monstrous to describe it. They needed a symbol for a cruelty so perfect it could only come from the mind of a queen, a monster who was now living and hunting in the castle on the hill. But here, we must ask a vital question. Was this horror truly all for a few drops of blood? Was this elaborate system of pain just a means to an end? The terrible truth, hidden in the confessions of her helpers, is that the magic was not working. The blood did not make her younger. The mirror still told its cruel, honest story every morning. The lines were still there. Time was still winning its war. And for a woman like Elizabeth, a woman who had never failed at anything, this failure was a source of deep, burning anger. And so, the mission changed. The goal was no longer the result. It was the process, the planning, the control, the performance of the ritual itself. This became the new, dark art that filled the emptiness of her days. The cruelty was no longer about a cure. It became the cure for her boredom. In those dark, locked rooms, Elizabeth Báthory found something that even her vast wealth and power could not give her in the outside world. She found a feeling of complete and total control. In that room, she was more than a countess. She was a god. She could decide who felt pain. She could decide who cried and who begged and who fell into silence. She could decide who lived and who died. It was the ultimate feeling of power, a feeling that made her forget the wrinkles in the mirror, a feeling that made her forget her own fear of death. The girls were no longer subjects in a scientific experiment. They were dolls in her private playhouse, objects for her to break and arrange as she pleased. This is where the true sadism was born. The pleasure was no longer in the idea of youth from the blood. The pleasure was in the power she felt as she caused the pain. The cruelty was no longer the means to an end. The cruelty was the end. She was no longer a desperate woman trying a magical cure. She was a predator, and she was simply enjoying the hunt. This dark, new purpose, this love for the power that pain gave her, gave birth to the most famous part of her story. It is the image that has haunted our nightmares for centuries. It is the legend that transformed the Countess of Čachtice into the Blood Countess. It is the story of the bath of blood. Picture a room hidden deep within the castle, where no outsider has ever set foot. It is a private bathhouse built of dark stone. The air is thick and heavy, warm with the steam from heated water, and sweet with the smell of expensive oils and perfumes. It is a beautiful, cloying scent designed to cover up another, much sharper smell that clings to the walls. In the center of the room, sunk into the floor, is a large pool made of white marble, a work of art. But tonight, the marble is stained a deep, brilliant crimson. The pool is not filled with water. It is filled with the freshly drawn blood of her victims. The Countess enters. Her helpers, her coven, follow her like silent ghosts, their faces lit by the flickering candlelight. They do not speak. This is a holy moment in their dark religion. Elizabeth lets her silken robes fall to the floor. She is no longer just a countess. In this secret room, she is a goddess, preparing for her most sacred ritual. She steps down into the pool. She feels the unnatural warmth of it on her skin. She closes her eyes and leans her head back. She does not feel the horror of what she is doing. She feels only a strange, powerful peace. In her mind, this is not the blood of the dead. It is the very essence of life. It is a magical fountain of youth, and she is its only believer. She believes that with every moment she spends in this terrible bath, her skin is becoming smoother, her body is becoming younger, and she is defeating time itself. She is not just washing her body, she is washing away her own mortality. It is a perfect, horrifying image, and it is almost certainly a lie. The story of the bloodbath was never mentioned in the hundreds of pages of testimony from her trial. Her own servants, who confessed to every other unspeakable act, never spoke of this. It was a legend that appeared in writing much later, a dark flower that grew from the soil of her real crimes. But the legend survives for a reason. It survives because it is a perfect symbol for the truth of her soul. She may not have literally bathed her body in blood, but she wanted to. She wanted to wrap herself in the life she had taken. She wanted to wear the youth of her victims like a silken cloak, a shield against the cold truth of her own aging. The bloodbath is a nightmare that shows us the shape of her desire, a desire so monstrous it could only be remembered as a dark and terrible fairy tale. Inside the castle walls, the Countess lived within her dark dream, but outside, in the world of the living, the nightmare was becoming real. One missing girl is a tragedy. 2 is a coincidence. But after 3, 4, then 10, then 20 girls disappear from the villages surrounding the castle, it is no longer a coincidence. It is a pattern. It is a hunt. The fear began as a quiet whisper, a secret shared between grieving mothers. But soon, that fear grew into a sickness that spread through the entire region. Life in the villages changed. Families no longer let their daughters walk alone. A knock on the door from a well-dressed stranger was no longer a sign of opportunity. It was a sign of terror. The sight of the great castle on the hill, once a symbol of power and protection, now felt like a curse. It was a shadow that loomed over their lives, a place that stole their children. The people were too afraid to say the Countess's name. To speak against her was to invite her attention, and no one wanted that. So they gave the evil on the hill a new name, a name from a dark fairy tale. They called her the Ogre of Čachtice, and the whispers were growing louder. They began to reach the ears of people with some authority. A local Lutheran minister, a man named István Magyari, started to hear the terrible stories from the families in his church. He tried to offer comfort, but he knew this was a human evil, not a simple act of fate. Local officials started to notice that the names of too many young women were vanishing from their records. The fear was no longer just the sorrow of poor peasants. It was becoming an open secret, a problem that responsible men knew they could not ignore forever. But what could they do? The whispers were growing. The evidence was in the empty chairs at every family's table. But the woman in the castle was not just a landowner. She was a Bathory. Her family were princes and kings. Her power felt as high and as untouchable as the stone walls of her fortress. To speak an official accusation against her was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. Who would dare to fight the ogre when the ogre was a queen? For years, the Countess was safe. As long as her victims were the daughters of poor peasants, their cries were just whispers in the wind. Their lives were cheap, and the world of powerful men did not care. But Elizabeth was growing bolder, and she was growing more desperate. The mirror on her wall was still her greatest enemy, and in her twisted, arrogant mind, she found a new reason for her failure. The blood of peasant girls, she decided, was too thick. It was dirtied by hard work and poor food. It was not pure enough. She needed the blood of her own kind, the clean, pure, noble blood of aristocratic girls. This was a dangerous new game. But how could she lure the daughters of noble families into her castle? She could not simply offer them jobs as servants. She needed a more clever, more tempting trap. And so, she created one. She sent out official letters to all the lesser noble families in the region. These were families with a proud name, but not much money or land. The Countess Bathory announced that she was opening a special academy, a school, right inside her own castle. It would be a school for their daughters. We must understand what this offer meant to these families. It was the chance of a lifetime, a golden ticket. In the 16th century, a young noblewoman's only future was a good marriage. And a girl who was taught by the great Countess Bathory herself, the niece of the King of Poland, would be the most sought-after bride in the entire kingdom. Elizabeth promised to teach their daughters everything they needed to know: how to dress, how to dance, how to speak to princes and dukes, how to behave at the king's royal court. She was not just offering lessons, she was offering to turn their daughters into queens. For an ambitious family, this was a promise that was impossible to refuse. These noble families lived far away. They did not hear the fearful whispers of the peasants, and even if they did, they would not have believed them. In their minds, the troubles of the poor had nothing to do with their own safe, protected world. All they saw was the powerful name of Bathory and a golden future for their children. The invitations were sent, the families gratefully accepted. The trap was set, and one day, a fine carriage pulled by 4 black horses made its way up the winding road to Čachtice Castle. It stopped before the great gate. A servant opened the door, and a young woman stepped out. She was the daughter of a nobleman, dressed in fine clothes, her face full of hope for the future she had been promised. She did not know she was the first of a new, more dangerous harvest. The dragon had feasted on sheep for years. Now, it was ready to devour the wolves, and attacking the nobility was a mistake that even a Bathory could not afford to make. The golden promise of the Countess's academy was a brilliant trap, built on the hopes and ambitions of proud families. But the plan, as clever as it was, had one fatal flaw. It was a flaw born not of cruelty, but of simple communication. When a peasant girl disappeared, she was erased from the world. Her family had no one to write to, no one to complain to. Their sorrow was a quiet, lonely thing. But the daughters of the nobility were different. They were part of a larger world. They had parents who expected letters. They had cousins who attended the royal court, and uncles who commanded soldiers. They were not invisible, and when they vanished, the silence they left behind was loud. At first, a noble father whose daughter had gone to the academy would not worry. When weeks passed with no letter, he would tell himself that she was simply busy with her important studies. Perhaps the winter roads were bad and the messenger had been delayed. He might send a polite message to the castle and would receive a polite reply from the Countess's staff. The girl was well, they would write, but was feeling slightly ill and was being cared for. Or perhaps she was on a private religious retreat and could not be disturbed. The excuses were always perfect, believable. But then, two of these fathers, perhaps old friends who had fought together in the wars, might meet at a wedding or a court event. They would talk about their families, about their children. One would mention his daughter, who was studying with the great Countess Bathory. The other would say that his daughter too was at the academy. They would speak of the strange silence, of the lack of letters, and they would discover that both their daughters were supposedly ill or on retreat at the exact same time. And in that moment, a cold fear would replace their trust. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a pattern. The polite inquiries to the castle stopped. They were replaced by worried demands. Then, the worried demands became angry accusations. These were not the whispers of peasants that could be ignored. These were the formal complaints of powerful men, written on expensive paper and sealed with the wax of a noble house. A river of these letters began to flow to the great cities of Vienna and Budapest, landing on the desks of the highest officials in the kingdom. For the first time, the name Bathory was being spoken in the halls of power, not with respect, but with suspicion. The shouts of the nobility were a different kind of noise, a noise that could shake the throne itself. The king could no longer look away. The case of the Ogre of Čachtice was finally, officially open. The net was beginning to close. The King of Hungary now had a serious problem. The complaints from his noble families were too loud to ignore. He knew he needed to act, but this was a delicate situation. He could not send a simple group of soldiers to the castle of a Bathory. To hunt a creature this powerful, you needed a special kind of hunter. And the king knew exactly who that hunter was. His name was György Thurzo. Thurzo was the Palatine of Hungary. This was the second most powerful title in the entire kingdom. The Palatine was the king's right-hand man. He was a great judge, a powerful general, and when he spoke, it was with the authority of the king himself. He was one of the few men in the country whose power could match Elizabeth's own, and, in a strange twist of fate, he was also her cousin. He knew the Bathory family. He knew their pride, he knew their power, and he knew their dark reputation. The king called Thurzo to his court and gave him a direct and secret order. Go to the lands of the Countess Bathory. Find out if these terrible rumors are true, and if they are, put an end to it by any means necessary. With that order, the game changed. This was not a grieving father or a local priest trying to find justice. This was the state itself, moving silently and purposefully. Thurzo was not a man who could be fooled by a noble name or a show of wealth. He was patient, he was clever, and he was completely loyal to the king. He was a hunter, and he had just been given his prey. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth Báthory had a real enemy. An enemy with the power, the intelligence, and the will to tear down her castle walls and drag her secrets out into the light. The hunter was on his way, and the countess, busy with her dark rituals, had no idea he was coming. Here he was. György Thurzo was a patient hunter. He knew an accusation against a Bathory needed to be a perfect weapon, sharp and unbreakable. So, before he acted, he gathered his proof. He sent his most trusted men, disguised as simple travelers, into the lands ruled by the countess. They did not come to command. They came to listen. They moved quietly through the villages, promising the king's protection to anyone brave enough to speak the truth. And slowly, after years of terrified silence, the stories began to spill out. Thurzo's men wrote everything down. Every name, every date, every heartbreaking detail. The pages of the investigation began to fill with the quiet sorrow of the people. One testimony came from a father, a minor nobleman, his voice heavy with guilt. He said, The Countess promised to make my daughter a true lady. I gave her a small bag of coins for her journey. I watched her carriage ride away. It was the last time I ever saw her. Another came from a young woman who had escaped. She showed the investigators the small white scars that covered her arms and hands. "It was a game to her," she whispered. Some days she would call us to her room just to stick us with needles to see if we would flinch. We learned not to make a sound. A local priest gave a more chilling account. He spoke of nights when he would see the Countess's most trusted servants, Fichko and Ilona Ho, carrying large, heavy baskets into the church graveyard long after midnight. They would dig in the unconsecrated ground where no good Christian would be buried. He said, "I did not know what they were burying. They were too small to be adults. I was too afraid to ask." Thurzo read every word. He saw the pattern. The law was always a promise of a better life. The cruelty was always creative and personal. And the end was always a silent, unmarked grave. He collected the names of the missing girls, and the list grew longer and longer and longer. Each story was a single stone, but Thurzo was patient. He kept collecting the stones, one horrifying testimony at a time. He now had a mountain of evidence, a mountain so large, so heavy with truth, that it would be enough to crush even a Bathory. He had the words of the living, the whispers of the dead, and the authority of the king. He now had the proof he needed. It was time to enter the dragon's lair. While György Thurzo's men moved silently through the villages, gathering their mountain of proof, inside the high walls of Čachtice Castle, a different kind of poison was spreading. It was not a poison of the body, but of the mind. It was the poison of fear. The Countess, who had lived her entire life feeling untouchable, began to feel the eyes of the world on her. Her brilliant, calculating mind, once focused on her dark rituals, now turned to paranoia. She saw plots everywhere. If two maids whispered together in a hallway, she would see them as conspirators and have them punished for secrets they did not have. The castle, once her safe fortress, where she was the absolute god, was beginning to feel like a trap, its walls closing in on her. At night, she would walk the cold stone corridors, a ghost in her own home, listening at doors, certain that everyone, even the people she had raised from nothing, was plotting her downfall. And her inner circle, the loyal helpers who had been her partners in cruelty, were beginning to drown in that same fear. They had believed her power was a shield that would protect them forever. Now, they understood the terrible truth. They were not her partners. They were her tools. And when the hunters finally came for the dragon, they would be the first to be thrown to the wolves. Their unity, forged in secret and blood, began to crumble. The old woman, Dorko, no longer whispered of magic for youth. Now, she burned strange, foul-smelling herbs in her room, frantically searching her old books for a spell of protection, a way to make them all invisible to the eyes of the law. Ilona Jo, the loyal nurse, became a wreck of nerves. Her hands trembled so much that one evening, while pouring wine for the Countess, she spilled a few dark red drops on the table. Elizabeth did not shout. She simply stopped and gave her a long, cold, silent stare. And in that silence, Ilona felt more terror than any threat could deliver. Even Fichko, the loyal brute, grew jumpy. He would sit for hours, sharpening his blades, his simple mind only understanding one solution to a threat: violence. The trust that had been built on shared secrets was now being eaten away by shared fear. They began to argue in hushed, terrified voices in the dark corners of the kitchen. "We should run," Fichko would whisper, his hand on the hilt of a dagger. "Flee before they come for us." "And go where, you fool?" Dorko would hiss back. The Countess's name is the only thing protecting us. If we run, we are just common criminals. This has to stop, Ilona would weep quietly. We have gone too far. We have to beg for the Countess's mercy. But there was no mercy left in the Countess. One night she overheard them. She heard their whispers of fear, of running away, of stopping, and she reminded them who was in control. She confronted Fixco alone, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Do not think you can run from me," she told him. "There is no place on this earth you could hide where my family could not find you. Our fates are tied together now. You will be loyal to me, or you will not be at all." The Coven of Cruelty was broken. The loyalty that had been bought with power was dissolving into panic. They were turning on each other, pointing daggers in the dark. And they were so busy watching each other, they did not hear the sound of the hunter's footsteps, finally arriving at their door. The end came on a cold night, just after Christmas, in the year 1610. György Thurzo had finished his investigation. He had his mountain of proof. He had the king's authority. It was time to enter the dragon's lair. He arrived at Čachtice Castle with 300 armed soldiers. This time, they did not disguise themselves as travelers. This time, they did not knock. The great wooden doors were forced open with the power of 30 men, the sound of splintering wood echoing into the night. The soldiers poured into the castle, spreading through the halls like a flood. They moved quickly, their orders clear. The castle staff were frozen with shock and fear. There was no resistance. Thurzo and his personal guard went straight to the places the witnesses had described. They went down into the cold, damp, lower levels. And there, they found it all. The rumors were no longer rumors. The whispers were no longer whispers. The horror was real. They found the dark, hidden cells. They found girls, chained and starving, their eyes wide with a terror that had long since burned away their tears. They found the instruments of torture still stained with blood. And in one cold room, they found the pale, lifeless body of the most recent victim, waiting to be disposed of. The hunt for the Countess's inner circle was swift. Dorko was dragged from her room, muttering curses. Ilona Jo was found weeping in a corner, and Fitchko was taken down by 4 soldiers, his strength no match for the Palatine's army. With the accomplices in chains and the survivors being tended to, Thurzo knew the most difficult part was yet to come. He left his men to secure the dungeons and walked back up the stone staircases alone. His footsteps echoed in the now silent castle. He had to face the dragon herself. He found her in the great dining hall. The room was warm, lit by the glow of a roaring fire. And at the head of a long, empty table sat the Countess Elizabeth Báthory. She was dressed in a gown of black velvet, and as he entered, she looked up, her face a mask of cold, aristocratic anger. She was not afraid. She was insulted. Thurzo stood before her. He did not need to show her the proof he had collected. The proof was screaming and weeping in the dungeons below them. He simply told her that he was acting on the authority of the king, and that her time as the unquestioned ruler of Čachtice was over. His soldiers waited for the order. They expected him to command them to seize her, to put her in iron chains, just like her servants. But Thurzo knew the reality of their world. He looked at the woman before him. She was a monster, but she was also a Bathory. To put a woman of her power on public trial would create a scandal so huge it could damage the entire kingdom. And so, Thurzo made a decision that shocked his own men. He did not order her arrest. He looked at the most prolific killer the kingdom had ever known, and he simply sentenced her to house arrest. She was forbidden from ever leaving her castle again. The monster had been found. Her servants were in chains, her secrets unearthed. But the dragon itself was too powerful to be caged like a common criminal. A trial was set for her accomplices, but the world held its breath and asked a terrifying question. How do you punish a killer who is untouchable? And what happens when a creature of such immense rage is cornered, with nothing left to lose? The trial began in the winter of 1611. The great hall was filled with the most important judges and officials in the kingdom. The air was heavy with the weight of the terrible secrets that were about to be told. But as the trial began, everyone noticed the same strange thing. There was an empty space where the most important person should have been. The Countess Elizabeth Báthory was not on trial. Her great family name was still a shield, protecting her from the final shame of a public judgment. Instead, the court would put her helpers on trial: her coven, her hands, and her teeth. In the center of the room stood Ilona Jo, the loyal nurse, Dorko, the old woman of magic, and Fichko, the loyal brute. They were no longer the proud, feared servants of a great countess. They were pale, thin, and broken, their eyes filled with the terror of their own coming deaths. And now, to save themselves, they were ready to tell the world everything. One by one, they were brought forward to confess. Each one tried to blame the others. Each one tried to make their own part in the horror seem smaller. Ilona Jo, the nurse, spoke through tears. She told the court that she had only acted out of love and fear for her mistress. "The Countess ordered it all," she cried. "She was my lady. I held her when she was a baby. How could I say no? She has a terrible temper. I was afraid she would kill me too." Dorko, the old mystic, tried to claim she was innocent of the worst crimes. She tried to blame the others for being too cruel. "I only suggested old remedies, simple magic," she insisted. It was the Countess who demanded blood, and the others, they enjoyed the cruelty far too much. Fichko, the simple-minded brute, said he was just a servant following orders. He claimed he was not smart enough to plan such things, and that he only did what the women told him to do. "The Countess and Dorko, they planned everything," he said, his voice low. "I was only a tool in their hands." They each told their own story. They each pointed a finger at the others. But every confession, every tear, every desperate excuse told the same horrifying tale. They described the girls, their names, their faces. They described the needles, the beatings, the freezing water, and the fire. They painted a picture of a castle that had been turned into a factory of pain. And every story, no matter who was telling it, was like an arrow, flying from that courtroom and heading straight toward the silent castle on the hill. They were all describing the same monster, and her name was Elizabeth Báthory. The judges had heard enough. The confessions, filled with hundreds of horrifying details, painted a clear picture of what had happened inside the walls of Čachtice Castle. The guilt of the three servants in the dock was beyond any doubt. The verdict was swift, and the sentence was brutal. Justice in the 17th century was a harsh and violent thing, designed to create fear and send a message. For the two women, Dorko and Ilona Jo, the court decided on a punishment of terrible pain. First, their fingers, the very fingers that had helped their mistress with her tortures, were to be torn from their hands with hot iron pincers. After this, they were to be tied to wooden posts and burned alive in a great fire so that their bodies and their dark secrets would turn to ash and be scattered by the winter wind. For Fichko, the loyal brute, the court decided his part was smaller, so his punishment was quicker, but just as final. He was to be taken to a wooden block and beheaded with a single swing of a sword. A few days later, the sentence was carried out. A great crowd gathered to watch the end of this terrible story. They watched as the helpers of the Blood Countess paid the price for their crimes. The tools the Countess had used were now broken. The hands that had helped her commit her terrible crimes were now gone. The Coven of Cruelty had been destroyed. But everyone in that crowd, as they watched the smoke rise into the grey winter sky, was thinking the same thing. The servants were dead. But what about their master? What about the monster herself? The crowd's question hung in the cold winter air. What about the Countess? What about the monster herself? The answer would be a frustrating one for those who wanted to see true justice. Elizabeth Báthory would never stand before a judge. She would never be brought before a crowd to answer for her crimes. To understand why, we must remember who she was. She was not just a killer. She was a Bathory. Her uncle had been the king of Poland. Her family was connected to every other great noble house in the kingdom. To put a woman of her immense power on a public trial would have been a monumental scandal. Her crimes were so terrible, so dark, that they would bring shame not just on her, but on the entire Hungarian nobility. It would make the great families look weak, corrupt, and monstrous in the eyes of their own people, and in the eyes of their enemies. The king and his palatine, Gheorghe Thurzo, decided that the problem had to be handled quietly. The story and the countess had to be buried. And so, there was no grand trial for Elizabeth. There was no public confession. The families of the hundreds of girls she had destroyed would never get to look her in the eye and see her judged for what she had done. The queen was too powerful to be tried like a common person. Her crimes were considered too shameful to be spoken of in an open court. But that did not mean she would go unpunished. Thurzo had planned a different kind of sentence. A punishment that was not about a quick death, but about a slow, silent, and complete erasure from the world. The king and his palatine had decided on a punishment that was, in many ways, more terrible than a quick and merciful death. A public execution would have been a spectacle, making her a martyr or a legend in a single, fiery moment. But mercy was not the goal. Thurzo, the hunter who had studied his prey so well, designed a punishment not for her body, but for her mind. The goal was humiliation. The goal was a slow, silent, and complete erasure from the world. They did not send an executioner to her castle. They sent bricklayers. By order of the king, Elizabeth Báthory was sentenced to be imprisoned within her own home, in a small suite of rooms in the highest tower of Čachtice Castle. She would be trapped forever inside the very symbol of her power. She likely stood in proud, furious silence as the work began. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would listen to the sounds of her own burial. The wet, scraping sound of the trowel, the heavy slap of mortar, the dull, solid thud of each brick being laid in place. These were the sounds of her world shrinking, one brick at a time. First, they sealed the windows. She would have watched as the view of her lands, the forests she owned, the villages she ruled, was slowly blotted out. The light grew dimmer and dimmer until a final brick was placed and the sun was stolen from her forever. Then they moved to the doors. The sounds of the castle, the voices of the servants, the life of the home she commanded, all faded as the walls grew thicker. Finally, the last brick was set in place. There was no handle, no key, no lock. There was only a solid wall of stone. In the wall, a single, small hole was left, just large enough for a plate of food to be passed through. She was now a ghost in her own house. This punishment was a masterpiece of poetic and terrible justice, for it took from her everything she had ever valued. Think of it. The woman who was obsessed with her own reflection, who stared into her mirror every day fearing the slightest sign of age, was now condemned to live in total darkness. She would never see her own face again. The mirror, her tyrant and her obsession, was now just a useless piece of glass in a black room. The woman who had a god complex, who delighted in the ultimate power of deciding who lived and who died, was now utterly powerless. Her entire existence depended on the mercy of an anonymous guard's hand, pushing bread and water through a hole in the wall. She, who had commanded thousands, could no longer command even a single candle to be lit. The woman whose family name was her greatest source of pride was now a nameless creature in a stone box. Her name, Bathory, which had shaken kingdoms, was now a forbidden word. She was alive, but for the rest of the world, she had simply ceased to exist. The woman who had lived in decadent luxury, surrounded by silken clothes and sleeping in soft feather beds, was now left with nothing but a cold stone floor and the rags on her back. And perhaps the most fitting justice of all, the woman who had filled her castle with the screams of hundreds of victims was now condemned to absolute, unending silence. There were no more servants to command, no more girls to torture, no more helpers to conspire with. There was only Elizabeth, alone in the dark, with nothing for company but the endless echo of her own thoughts and the memory of every terrible thing she had ever done. A quick execution would have been an escape. But this was not an escape. This was a cage, perfectly built for the monster it was meant to hold. She had been erased. And so, the days turned into nights, and the nights turned into years. For nearly 4 years, Elizabeth Báthory lived in her stone tomb. She could not see the sun rise or set. The changing of the seasons, the green of spring, the warmth of summer, meant nothing to her now. Her world was only darkness and silence, broken just once a day by the scraping sound of a plate of food being pushed through the small hole in the wall. This leads us to one final, unanswerable question. What does a mind like that do when it is left alone in the dark with nothing but its own memories? Did she feel any regret for what she had done? In the unending silence of her prison, did she finally hear the ghostly echoes of the screams that had once filled her castle? Did she see the faces of the hundreds of girls she had destroyed? Or did her great Bathory pride refuse to break, even in the end? Did she spend her final years not in sorrow, but in a state of pure, cold rage? Was she angry at her victims for being weak, at her helpers for confessing, at Thurzo and the king for daring to challenge her? Did she die believing she had done nothing wrong? No one will ever know. Her final thoughts are the one secret she took with her to the grave. In the late summer of 1614, a guard came to her cell to deliver her daily meal. He pushed the plate through the small hole in the wall, but he heard no sound from inside. He called out to her, but there was no reply. After waiting for a long time, he called the captain of the guard. They decided to break down the wall. The same masons who had sealed her in were called back to set her free. With hammers and chisels, they broke through the stone and mortar, letting the light spill into her tomb for the first time in years. They found her lying on the floor. She was cold and still. The great and terrible Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the Ogre of Čachtice, the Blood Countess of legend, had died, just as she had lived for the last 4 years of her life, utterly and completely alone. In the end, the walls of Čachtice Castle keep their secrets. Elizabeth Báthory died as she had lived her final years, in silent, absolute darkness, a prisoner in her own home. The official records paint a clear picture of a sadistic monster, a woman who used her immense power to commit unspeakable atrocities. Yet the whispers of conspiracy never truly faded. Was she framed by powerful men, including her own relatives, who stood to gain her vast fortune? Or was the truth even darker, that her cruelty was so profound it had to be transformed into legend? Over the centuries, the historical facts of her case, the missing girls, the torture, the trial, were embellished with tales of bloodbaths and dark magic. The real-life horror of the Countess became a blueprint for the fictional horror of the vampire, forever linking her name to the shadow of Dracula. The story of Elizabeth Báthory forces us to confront the terrifying nature of unchecked power and the line where history ends and myth begins. What do you believe happened inside that castle? Was she history's most savage female killer, or its most slandered woman? We want to hear your theory. Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you find these journeys into the darkest chapters of history as fascinating as we do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that have been lost to time. Click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching.